Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I want to show you my process of turning a bowl that's partially seasoned through to a finished bowl. Right now, this figured piece of Clara walnut's sitting about 15% moisture content. If I turn it start to finish right now, it's probably going to crack and it's definitely going to move, and the foot's not going to sit nice and flat. So we'll go over the turning techniques as well as some of the things I do to expedite the drying process from a partially seasoned piece. As well as some of the different holding methods when I get this roughed out and some of the things I do to get it to where it'll dry a little bit quicker. So I've got this piece pre-drilled for my screw center chuck. It's ready to go. It's about an 8" by 3. And we've got a ton of really gorgeous figure in here. If it was a little bit bigger bowl blank, I'd probably core it out just to get an extra bowl out of the center of this. But it's small enough, I'm just going to rough this out and get it ready to dry. So I've got this pre-drilled. Now we can go ahead and mount it on our lathe. All right, make sure you get your safety glasses or your face shield on. And then I'll turn the lathe on as slow as it'll go, and then we'll mount this on the screw center chuck. And then just let it take it out of your hands as soon as it's seated against the collar. And then we'll lock our spindle and tighten this up. Let's get our tool rest in place. We'll give that a quick spin, make sure it's not contacting, and it'll free spin. And then we'll bring up our tailstock. All right, we'll get our revolving center. One thing that I like to do with a piece where I'm trying to maintain as much of the material as possible, I don't want to drive my revolving center in there and damage a bunch of the wood fibers. So you can either get a little wooden block as a shim spacer piece, or you can use, your pen mandrel, your brass nut from the pen mandrel actually works really well. And that'll give us the support we need, but it's not going to damage all that wood fiber that the revolving center normally does. And then we'll just snug that up. For this piece, the first step is we're going to rough this out, get it trued up. We're going to get a rough profile of our bowl, a rough shape, and we'll turn a nice big tenon for our chuck. Once we get that, we'll flip it around and we'll hollow out a lot of the bowl and a lot of that material that we don't need anymore. That'll help expedite the drying process, speed things up. Because I want to be able to have this as a finished piece in about 2 weeks. At 15% in our atmosphere and our climate and temperature and everything, I should be able to get this down to 6 to 8% in about a couple weeks, maybe even a little bit quicker. So we'll be checking that every couple of days. Depending on where you live, things might dry a little bit slower, they might dry quicker. So it's always worth having a moisture meter. You can check the content of the wood every couple of days as it's drying. So this is what the bowl is going to look like after we're done. So I've got a big recess in here that I can re-chuck after the bowl is dry. And then I've got my tenon on here as well. I'm using the 5" bowl jaws on here. That way, if the tenon warps or moves, I can true it up and still have a tenon that'll fit my chuck jaws. But the biggest thing is just making sure we have a nice consistent shape on the outside and removing a lot of the bulk on the inside. That's going to help speed up the drying process. And when it warps a little bit, you still have enough room to true that up and then get a good finished bowl out of it. So this one I've been let sitting for a couple of days. It's already down a couple moisture percentage. But let's start roughing this out. So I'll set this off to the side. Adjust my tool rest just a little bit. And we can turn on the lathe now, and we'll turn up to speed nice and slow. Anytime you put a new piece on the lathe, always bring it up to speed nice and slow. And for an 8" diameter piece like this, I'm right about 1,000 RPM. And I want to true up the exterior, and then we can start working our external shape here. So bowl gouge, we'll just use this to true up the outside. As soon as I get to here, I don't want to blow out these end grain fibers that are unsupported, so I'm going to slow my cut down and just ease that off. If you get too crazy as far as pushing that across, all these fibers right here are unsupported and they'll always curl out. And we want to maintain as much diameter of this as possible. So once we get pretty much to round, there's a couple flat spots. I'm going to cut just a little bit more off because I want to get all the wax off this piece. So another 1/16 or so off. And then slow that cut down right there. And we should have a nice trued up piece. There's a little bit of wax right there. Take just a little bit more off on the last inch here. Okay. I'm going to move my tool rest around, and we can start removing some of the bulk here to get our rough bowl profile, and then we'll cut our recess for our chuck jaws. Once I start cutting this out, I want to make sure my flute's pretty much closed. If I go in there with an open flute, it's going to catch on me. So make sure you roll that flute over to about 9 o'clock. I'll adjust my tool rest in, make sure that tool's supported. I'm going to move my tool rest out of the way for a second. And now I've got my calipers. This is set for my chuck jaws. So I'm going to get my mark on there to give myself a rough estimate of my diameter of my tenon that I need. And that way I don't turn this shape too much and then I have a really small tenon. And then we can set our tool rest back into place. Okay, we're getting our rough bowl profile. I'll adjust my tool rest over a touch, and we'll start cutting that tenon. That larger bowl gouge has enough radius on the tip of the tool to not give me a nice clean corner for my dovetail. So I'm going to use my spindle gouge to go in there and just clean that up and straighten everything out. That spindle gouge has a lot pointier nose on it, so it allows me to get in there and get that nice square dovetail that we need. Got a little bit of shavings there. I'm just going to go back in and clean that up. So the biggest thing I'm looking for is a nice square face that the chuck jaw face will register against, and then a nice dovetail profile right here. That's going to give you a really good secure hold. Plus, the diameter of this is big enough that if it does warp, which it will, hopefully not too much, but it's big enough I can reduce that down and still have it fit my chuck jaws. So I'm going to clean off this face here and get rid of the wax. And it's running pretty true, so I don't need to take off a bunch of material. I just want to get rid of all that wax to allow that wood to breathe and then dry fairly quickly. That's one of the biggest complaints about wood turning is when you have a really wet piece of wood, it just takes so long to go from a green wood to a dry finished piece. So hopefully this will help you, speed things up a little bit. I should go from 15% to a dry bowl in about 2 weeks where I'm at. So I've got a little bit left, a little bit of wax left over right there. I'm going to do just a couple more cuts, and then we can get a nice clean profile on the exterior of the bowl. I also like to chamfer my dovetails just a little bit. Gets rid of those sharp corners on there. That way you don't risk cutting yourself with anything. And now I'll go to my 3/8 bowl gouge and get a push cut on here. This one's got a shorter nose on the bevel. That'll allow me to get in there with the tailstock in place and try and get a good profile and a good clean cut as well. So let's stop the lathe and take a look. So the push cut with a bowl gouge gives you a really clean surface because all the wood fibers are being supported as they're being cut. So you get a really clean surface. That's what I want to leave behind. I'm going to stop right here because I do have some checking in the top surface of this that I'll be removing some of that material, so I'm not worried about finishing that cut all the way to the rim. But I've got a good clean dovetail. I've got my rough bowl profile. I've got enough material here now to where once this is dry, we still have plenty of material to get the right shape we want in our bowl, and we have our nice clean dovetail. So let's take this off the screw center chuck. We'll put it in our 4-jaw chuck, and then we can hollow out the center of the bowl and get our dovetail cut for the recess in the inside as well. Now that my tailstock's out of the way, I'm just going to remove that little bit of wax where that washer was in place. And that's all it takes. I didn't seat that chuck very well, and I don't want this coming unscrewed on me, so I'm just going to loosen that up and then just give that a good flick. Make sure that chuck's seated on there. If you don't seat these on there, when you turn the lathe off, the brake slows it down faster than the centrifugal force, and a lot of times those can unscrew on you. So, but now that we have this rough profile, we've got our dovetail cut. Let's go ahead and mount this in our chuck. And tighten down both those pinion gears. And you can see the gap between those chuck jaws. Normally that's a little bit bigger than what I'd like, but I know I'm going to have to true up my dovetail again later, and I want to make sure I still have enough material that these will clamp down on there. So now that we have this back in our chuck, we have a rough profile. Let's clean off the face. Then we can hollow out the center of the bowl and then cut a recess that we'll use to remount the chuck later. All right, let's get our tailstock out of the way. Get our tool rest set up here. And I do have a little bit of surface checking, so I'm going to reduce about 1/8 of an inch off the face of this piece just to get rid of that checking, because I don't want that to continue to spread. And then give that a quick spin and make sure you're not contacting anywhere. I'll go back to my, this is a 1/2 inch bowl gouge, so 5/8 bar. And now that we're trued up, I'm actually going to bump the speed up just a hair. We're about 1100 RPM, 1200. We'll just face the piece off. One thing that's worth noting is the wax that your blanks are usually coated in. This makes your shop floors really, really slippery. So anytime I'm roughing out waxed pieces, I try to sweep it up right away. I don't want to track the wax around my shop because it turns it into an ice skating rink. So I'm going to bump up the speed now just a little bit now that the face is true. One thing that's also worth mentioning is, I don't know if you can see, but on camera I'm kind of leaning over away from the bowl piece. If you do have a piece come out of the lathe, you never want to be standing right in line because that's the direction it's going to travel. So every time I'm turning a piece that definitely doesn't have my tailstock support, I'm always kind of out of the way a little bit just in case it does come off. It'll hit me in the shoulder, not my face. So let's check the surface. I can still see a little bit of the surface checking here. I'm going to remove some more material, and then we can hollow out the bowl. All right, let's see if we got rid of those checks. Okay, they're just barely there. I'm going to take just another couple cuts, and they should be good. Okay, those are just barely there. I don't really want to reduce the length of this piece anymore. So one thing I can do to help prevent those from cracking and splitting even more throughout the piece is actually just put a little bit of thin CA in those cracks. That'll help try and keep those together. All right, so I'll just put a couple of drops of CA and let that wick down into the crack. And that'll help keep those from spreading, and then wet that with some activator as well. But you can see the gorgeous figure we have in this piece. That Claro's got a lot of lights and darks going through it, and there's tons of figure in this piece, so I'm excited to get this dry and get it returned. So now that we have this face cleaned off, we got rid of most of the surface checking. Let's get our calipers set for our chuck jaws. We'll put our mark on there and then we can cut our recess and then start hollowing the bowl. All right, so I've got my calipers set for my chuck jaws. If you're ever using calipers on a lathe while it's moving, you only engage the side that's supported by the tool rest. Otherwise, it'll catch the side coming up at you and flip these over. So make sure you're only engaging the one side, and then I just line it up, make sure we're in line with both points. Now we can start hollowing this out. I think my tool rest is just a touch high. I'm going to drop it down 1/16 of an inch or so. But when we start hollowing this out, make sure your flute's closed, 3 o'clock position until you're on the bevel. And then you can open up the flute a little bit and then swing that around. Turning this at 15% and roughing a lot of the material away is really easy compared to when it's completely dry. Dry walnut's kind of a pain to turn because it's so dusty, and the dust is terrible for you as well. So definitely got a good skate there. We're going to cut that out in post. One thing that's worth mentioning as well is walnuts really is a known allergy to a lot of people. So anytime I turn walnut, I usually wear a mask. So I definitely recommend using a respirator or something like that. One thing you can see right now is I have my flute closed over and the handle swung way away from me. That allows me to get the cut started and get on the bevel. And then once we're on the bevel and everything's supported, then we swing our handle around and get that nice sweep radius on the inside of the bowl. The tool handle has an interesting arc to it, so we start away from us, and then once we're on the bevel, we rotate that flute open a little bit, and then I drop the handle and then swing it towards me, and then we raise it up right at the center. So once you get used to the movement of the tool handle, all those cuts are just really easy and controllable as well. So right now I have about a 1/2 inch till my recess mark, my recess mark. So I'm going to take a 1/4 inch away, and then we'll cut our recess for our chuck jaws. All right, now I'm going to cut the recess with my skew. You can see that wax is already making the floor slippery. If you need to, you can always throw a little bit of sand down on the concrete. That'll help give it a little more tack. Let's check our recess. So I want to make sure that this surface here is nice and flat for those chuck jaws to register against, and then we have our angle in there for the dovetail to expand into. The reason I do this instead of just turning the bowl out, which you can definitely do, and then using a jam chuck to remount later, it's nice to just expand into that. Then I can true up the foot, true up the outside, and then I can flip this around and then turn all this away. So a couple different options as far as returning bowls that have warped or greenwood or anything like that. So Now that we have this cut, I'm going to turn out just a little bit more of our bowl center, and then we'll talk about what we do to help this dry out and how I store it during the drying process. And I'm going to adjust my tool rest to it's closer on the center. That way my tool is not sticking so far over the rest and getting a little bit of chatter. Just gives me a little more flexibility with my tool control as well. Just get rid of that little nub in the center. Okay, I think we're all set. One thing that I like to do as well is I like to mark my tenon if I can remount it in the chuck jaws. That'll help me remount it a little more true as well. So this is chuck jaw number 3. I just put a mark on there and then I put number 3 on it. So now we can take this out of our chuck. So let's just go over what we've done so far. We've taken this from 15%. We've roughed out the exterior, got a rough bowl profile to it. We've left a really big tenon on there so when it warps we can true that up and still have it fit these chuck jaws. We've hollowed out the center of the bowl to remove a lot of the mass there to help speed up the drying process. We've cleaned up the face, got rid of some of the checks we had there, and then we've cut that recess. So this will be ready to sit aside for probably a week or two. We'll keep an eye on the moisture content every couple of days. The way I store these, there's a couple different options. So if I'm really trying to speed up the process, I'll just set this out on a table, and I'll just cover it with a plastic bag, just the very tops of it. I don't put them in the bag. Those don't allow enough air movement to help it dry fast. But just covering the top of these will slow the air movement down enough to where I don't get any cracking or severe warping, but it'll still allow it to dry fast. So hopefully I'll be able to have this turned in the next couple of weeks. We'll set this aside with my other bowls that I roughed out. We'll just cover these with a plastic bag, and then we'll just come back every day or so, just check the movement, make sure we're not getting any cracking, and check our moisture content. One other thing you could do too, if you're in a really, really dry climate, if you're down in Arizona or something where there's almost zero ambient moisture and it's really hotter in the summertime where your shop's really hot, you could throw these in a cardboard box with some of the shavings that are a little bit wet, and that'll help slow down that drying process, but still allow it to dry pretty quickly. So let's go set these aside. We'll come back in a couple of days and see what percent moisture content we have. All right, so we're back. It's been about 2 weeks since we rough turned these and wanted to let them dry. I tracked the moisture content on these about every 2 days over the last 2 weeks, and we started at 15%, and now we're down to that 6 to 7% range, so we can finally turn these out, get them finished and completed. As they were drying, I went and checked these about every day, making sure we didn't have any cracking or checking going on. If these did start checking on me, I would want to seal those cracks up with some CA and maybe cover them with a bag, something a little less air movement in them to help prevent any cracking. But these dried out pretty well. No cracking, no surface checking or anything. You can see my pin marks from my moisture meter. You want a good moisture meter when you're checking your moisture content. But these are ready to go. They definitely moved. The recess we cut for this is a little bit oval. Our tenon definitely warped a little bit, so we got the movement out of the piece that we wanted, and these will be ready to turn. So let's clear these off. We'll get this set up on our chuck, and we can go through and finish turning this out. All right, so let's get this mounted up on our chuck. And obviously we cut that recess earlier so we could remount it. We'll go ahead and tighten that up. If you didn't have a recess cut for that, you could use a jam chuck with some neoprene on it. That's what I use a lot of times. It's just a wooden waste block with some neoprene, and then I'll use my tailstock to return that foot. But cutting the recess in there definitely helps for work holding. So make sure both those pinion gears are nice and snug. And if you want to, you can definitely use your tailstock for support. But for me, I'm going to be doing push cuts, so I don't want the tailstock in the way. But I just want to true this up and then get my exterior shape profiled and sanded, so then we can flip it around and then turn out the inside. All right, give that a quick spin. Make sure you're not contacting your tool rest. I'll start the lathe, and you can see, nice and slow, that's definitely out around. We got the movement out of the piece. That's the biggest thing, is you can still have a piece that's fairly dry, and then when you turn it to your final shape, the wood contracts and shrinks a little bit, and then it goes out around again. But we got that movement out of the piece. So let's bump this up. Now we can true up our foot and get our exterior shape that we want on the piece. So I'm right about 1,000 RPM. That's going to be a good safe turning speed, but cutting efficiently as well. I'll go to my 3/8 bowl gouge. I'm going to cut that foot, true it up. True up the shoulder. That's going to contact the chuck jaws. And then we'll true up the base of the foot as well. Alright, so now that we have that trued up, I want to establish my exterior dimension and shape. We'll be using push cuts for most of that to get a really clean cut on the walnut. You could shear scrape, we can do some different techniques as we go through it. So I think my tool rest is set up where I need to be to do a push cut. That looks pretty good. Yeah, we're going to have support all the way throughout. So let's start cutting some wood. I'll do this there. Getting a little bit of chatter as that tool's getting further and further over the rest right here on the corner. So I'm going to stop that cut and adjust this just a hair. And then I'll pick that cut up back in the middle. And you could hear that tone change we got. Once we adjusted that tool rest and got more tool support, we got a lot less chatter. But we should have a really clean cut off that push cut. So now that we're through all the out around stuff and we're running true, now we can start working on getting our shape the exact way we want it. My favorite bowl profile is the Glenn Lucas style. So this is one of the bowls that Glenn did. It's some really pretty spalted beech, but I really like his simple profile, really clean lines, and a really good rim. So this is the shape I'm going to shoot for. So I usually try and set a piece off to the side, that way I have something to reference to for my shape. So it's always nice to pick up a bowl from another professional woodturner and see their shape, and then that way you can kind of mimic that style, because I really like the profile that he has. I'm going to go back to my bigger gouge. I want to take a little more material off than that 3/8 is letting me. Then I slow down right at the end there, because all these fibers are unsupported, so I want to slow that cut down. That way I don't blow out a bunch of those fibers there. You can see we already had some peel up a little bit, but you definitely want to get a nice controlled cut there. But you can see those burnished lines. That's from bevel contact. If you're pushing too hard on the bevel, it'll compress those fibers, and a lot of times you can get actually some weird ridges in there that are really hard to cut through. So you want to be light on your bevel contact, but still maintain that bevel pressure to where you're cutting safely as well. So I'm going to look at the horizon. I really like the profile we have there. It's a little bit rougher shape than I'd like, but we're getting close to that. We've got the nice little OG foot there to that nice contour on the outside. So I think we're pretty close to our final exterior dimensions, because we will be reducing some of this down once we're done with the inside and we flip it around to finish the foot off. So I don't want to reduce that too much, as well as I don't want to reduce the contact patch I have for my chuck jaws there. So take a look at my foot. It looks like there's a little bit of material just in the corner there I want to clean up. That way I get a good fit with my chuck jaws. So I'm going to use my skew, just the tip of it, get in there and just clean that up a little bit. And then we can play around with some different cutting techniques. So we've done the push cut. We can try a shear scrape now to see if it's a little more controllable, see if it'll refine that shape any better. And now that we're trued up, I'm going to bump the speed up to about 1200. And for my shear scrape, I'm going to drop my handle way down, and I'll be cutting on this bottom wing here. And I've got the flute almost completely closed over. And then you just lightly glide that across the surface. If you're having trouble with a push cut, a shear scrape's a really good option. I know Mike Mahoney really likes the shear scrape, and Glenn Lucas does as well. But you can see the shavings we're getting off a shear scrape. It's really nice fine curls, so we're cutting efficiently. As that wood comes across that edge, it just glides it off on that nice sharp tool and then cuts really cleanly, and it's really controllable as well. It doesn't take a ton of skill or practice to master. But as I'm cutting, I'm looking at the top of the horizon here, watching that shape come out. You can see it against the background of your floor, your shop floor, a little bit easier than looking down here. And once I get near the top of the bowl, I kind of get jammed up with the lathe, so I'll switch hands and then cut right-handed, I guess. I'm actually going to need to adjust my rest over. And as I'm shear scraping, I'm not scraping towards the foot because then the fibers are unsupported. I want to make sure I'm cutting uphill as the fibers are supported that way. And then you want to do this with a really sharp tool as well. Looking at the horizon, I've got a really clean profile till about here, and then I've got a little bit of a high spot. Need to work down. And the nice thing is with that shear scrape, I can section off just a small amount of the area or a small amount of the turning. If I need to touch up just that section there, I can go in and touch that up without having to start an entire cut when I'm doing a push cut all the way through. So the shear scrape gives you a lot of versatility, and it's really easy to control as well. But the key is bumping your speed up just a little bit and then having a really sharp tool. So let's take a look at that surface and see what we think. So end grain cut really clean. Because this piece has so much figure in it, we're getting some side grain and end grain instead of just end grain, side grain, end grain, side grain, like a regular straight piece, straight grain piece of material. But it's cutting really clean. We got rid of our bevel marks. There's still a couple little marks there, but those will sand out no problem. So if I look at the shape, I really like the curve we have. We'll round that rim over once we flip the bowl around, but I do want to true up the face of this piece before we start sanding. I want to clean up the torn fibers we had on the face. So I'm going to rotate my rest around, and then we'll just scrape the face of that piece just to clean up those fibers and true it up as well. And then I'll just chamfer just the leading edge of the corner. I don't like having sharp corners on pieces because I've been cut too many times from leaving a really sharp edge on the end there. So now that this is trued up and cleaned, we've got our shape the way we want it. We've got a really good surface. I'm going to sand and finish this exterior shape. That way I don't have to come back to it, because once we remount this and we turn the inside out and the inside will be complete, we'll flip it around again to turn off this foot, and the chuck jaws we'll be using will be sticking over this about an inch or so. So I want to make sure that this surface is completely finished and done at this step. So I'll get my sander out. We'll start sanding this. We'll drop our speed down to about 500-600 RPM. And for the sanding process on this piece of material, I'm definitely going to use a mask. Walnut to me is a really nasty type of wood to turn. I'm really kind of allergic to the dust. So I'll be using a dust mask when I sand this piece. But we'll be using just our standard drill with a 2-inch disc holder. And I'll start out with 220 and see if that's cutting enough of the material. If that's not cutting efficiently, or if it's not removing the material the way I need, we'll go down to the 180, 120. So, but the surface is pretty clean. So we'll start with that 220. Just get my rest out of the way, give me some room to work. Make sure your pad's centered up, and then we can start sanding this out. Alright, so let's take a look at the surface we've got. That 220 is abrading and refining that surface really well. I think we're actually pretty good with the 220 from here, so we'll move up to our next grit. But just double check you don't have any torn grain, any issues in the surface before you move on to those finer grits. So we'll go on to 320, and I'm going to put my mask back on. So we've done the 320, now we'll go on to 400, and on a piece this figured, I'm going to go up to 800. The higher you refine that surface, the more the figure is going to show through and be more chatoyant. And there's so much figure in this piece, I really want to do it justice. We're going to go up to that 800 grit. Alright, now I'm going to stop the lathe and inspect the surface. Surface looks really good. I didn't sand down just at the base here because I know we'll be turning a lot of that, or some of that away here in a little bit. But I want to make sure basically from the rim, 2/3 of this is completely finished, because I don't want to have to come back and sand that, because it will be covered by those chuck jaws when we rechuck it. But the surface looks really good. Right now I'm going to get some denatured alcohol, strip the surface of the dust. Then we'll throw some sanding sealer on, and then cut that back a little bit with some steel wool, and then this will be ready to flip over. Alright, so I've got my denatured alcohol. I'm just going to wipe the surface down. Try and clean out a bunch of that dust before we put a sanding sealer in it. But you can see that figure just pops like crazy on this walnut. Gorgeous, gorgeous piece of material to work with. I'm going to be really excited to finish this piece up and have it completed. So you can see all the dust we got off there. Now we'll switch over to a clean side of the rag, and we'll use some sanding sealer. That'll give me a really good base I can use on this piece, and then we'll put probably tried and true over the top for our final finish. But the sanding sealer will help protect the wood fibers. It'll saturate deep down in there and seal everything up and make the piece a little more durable long term as well. But you can see with that sanding sealer on there, we've got some insane figure in this walnut. Alright, so we'll completely saturate the piece the area that we've sanded, and then we'll turn the lathe on and then just kind of buff dry that sanding sealer. The nice thing about the sealer is it's going to help prevent the tried and true, or whatever your top finish is, from darkening that walnut too much. A lot of finishes out there will make walnut way too dark, darker than it naturally looks. So I want something that'll retain the natural figure and color and then help protect the wood fibers. Just generate a little bit of heat and friction, help that sanding sealer kick over and cure. And then I'll use my Merlon. I'm going to bump the speed up to our turning speed, about 1200, and I'll use that 1500 grit Merlon to just knock the sanding sealer back just a little bit. Sometimes you get some streaking. And then I'll actually use some scratch free to just refine that surface just a little bit more as well. And we'll just buff that off. So you can see we've got a really nice refined surface. It allows that figure, all that curl in there is just absolutely gorgeous. Allows that to pop without looking plasticky. Just a nice natural warmth to the piece, and it feels really good in the hand as well. Now that we have the outside pretty much done and our foot retrued, we can take this off. Show you that figure there, just killer piece of material. This is the kind of stuff that makes me excited to wood turn. You get a piece, a piece of walnut like this, it just makes you want to get out to the shop and get it turned. So we'll remount that, snug that up with both those pinion gears, and now we can turn out the inside of the bowl, and then we'll finish the radius on our rim, and then we can flip it around. Okay, tool rest is at center working height, and then I'll adjust my tool rest in. Give me a little more support on the tool as we're inside that bowl. All right, we'll give that a quick spin, make sure we're not contacting our rest. Just gonna true up that face of the rim. Need to adjust my rest out for that first. You always want to true up the face of your rim, because when you try to start your bevel riding cut, if it doesn't have a nice flat surface to run into, it'll skip around and then skate on you. So you want to make sure that that is nice and true before we start hollowing this out. Now that the material is dry, it's definitely harder to cut, so you want to make sure your tools are sharp. And it will be a little bit dustier, so. I don't know if you could tell on that cut, but I started it out and I was pushing pretty hard to get through that, and we're taking roughly a 1/4 inch wide kerf as we're going through, and it was just getting a little too much bounce and chatter. So my feed rate, I slowed it down a little bit and just let that wood come off onto the tool. Sometimes you just want to core through this and get after it, but a lot of times when you're working hard dry material like this, you need to let the tool do the work and just let the slow your feed rate down a little bit. So for my thickness, my rim will probably be right about there, and then it'll be slightly undercut. to get rid of the mass down here in the bottom while still having a nice presentable rim there on the piece. So just put a mark on there, give yourself an outline to shoot for. All right, so when you start your cut, make sure you have your flute closed until there's somewhere for that bevel to ride, and then you can open that up a little bit and then ride that through. One thing I want to talk about real quick is that, you know, a lot of times when people are turning, they use this as a hand support, which, you know, depending on the situation makes sense, but for bowl turning, this is a tool rest, not a hand rest. When you have your hand anchored here, your movements get really jerky and it's not as controllable as just having your tool on the rest and then supporting that tool as it goes through. And my hand support here is I'm pinching the tool and basically just pulling it down, trying to help keep that as a smooth motion as I ride through on the bevel. But I never want to just anchor my hand here and then try and pivot off that. So make sure that flute's closed. Once my bevel's in contact, open up that flute. We'll stop the lathe real quick and just do a double check on our depth. So we've got a 1/4 inch of material before we, where the chuck jaw face is, and our tenon's about a 1/4 inch past that. I'm probably, I'd say a 1/4 inch to where I want to be on my depth of the piece, and then we can start opening up that shape a little bit more. But I still want to have enough material there that when we flip this around, I can shorten or keep the tenon the same length and play around with the design on the base. I don't want to corner myself into a certain foot shape or depth right now. So while we have the material, get your internal shape the way you want it, and then we can flip, once we flip it around, then you can play around with the shape and size. So as far as the wall thickness, it's pretty consistent with the curvature we have on the outside. We will be undercutting the rim to lighten that up a little bit because we don't want a really heavy piece. Flute closed. And you can see there, I started the cut pulling down on the tool, and once I got to here, I was kind of jammed up with the rest, so then I switched to the top, just pushing straight down into the tool, and then I finished that cut around. So I'm gonna go hit this on the grinder real fast. This dry walnut definitely takes your edge off pretty quick. So, all right, now that we have a fresh edge, I'll remove some more of that bulk we have down in the bottom, and then we'll go over a few different options you have as far as tools to refine the interior shape of your bowl. There's a bunch of good options out there, but we'll show you a couple different ways you can do it. One thing I did as well when I went to the grinder is I did throw a double bevel on there. It reduces the length of my main bevel and gives me a little more clearance in there so I don't get as much bevel rubbing burnishing lines. That's definitely cutting a lot easier. I don't know if you can tell from the sound. If you slip off the cut, just come back a little bit, pick that cut back up, and then ride it back down to center. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the profile we have in there. It's a little rough. We can definitely refine that. But right now I want to establish my rim diameter and get the shape that I'm looking for in my bowl. So this is the rim type that I'm going to try and copy. Obviously this is Glenn Lucas's bowl. It's a really pretty one we got from him. But a nice rounded edge, dropping rim, and then a concave interior of the bowl there. Really comfortable when you pick it up, and it just looks gorgeous as well. So I'll bring out my tool rest here, and I'll be switching to my smaller 3/8 gouge and start rolling that rim down in there just a bit, dropping that. So I feel like we've got a really good drop there now. And now we can establish that little undercut rim there. Just feeling the shape of that and seeing if that feels comfortable. So I feel like the drop we have in the rim is nice and comfortable. I think it looks sharp. And now I'm just gonna radius that rim. Do something similar to this, just a rolled edge right here on the end. So I've adjusted my tool rest. And then I'll come in here with my bowl gouge, my 3/8 with my flute closed, and I'll just scrape that rim just to radius that over. And we can use our sandpaper to refine that a little bit more. I'll actually bring that rest around, and now I'm going to cut from this side. Come back over here and just keep rolling that around. All right, let's just give that a feel. There's a little bit of a flat spot right there. I'm just going to refine that a little bit more. And then you can see our piece has moved just a little bit in the chuck. So we'll need to resand this top part of the rim. Let's try and smooth out that rolled edge just a little bit. Just using that bottom wing to scrape that, roll that over. You could use your scraper and just kind of work that around if you need to. But I think I might drop that rim just a little bit more on the inside. And then just try and blend that into that radius we have on the outside. And I think that looks pretty sharp. So now we can go back into the bowl and finish the inside, get a good clean cut in there, prep that for sanding. Adjust your tool rest in there so you're nice and supported. Center working height. And so now that we have our rim established, I don't really want to chance a skate right here, so I'm going to start just under that rim and we'll concave that and give that a little undercut there. That'll help keep whatever you put in the bowl instead of it just falling out. So make sure that flute's nice and closed, handle away from you. And the bevel length on that tool is just a little bit too big, so I'm going to go to my smaller gouge, try and pick that cut up. And then swing that around. All right, so we have a good established undercut there. Now I'm just going to clean up that surface and remove the rest of that bulk, and then we'll clean up the inside as well. Get that surface ready. Tool rest is just a touch high. It's not allowing me to get down to that center nub. Drop that tool rest just a touch. Okay, so our shape's pretty good on the undercut here. There's a couple of tool marks. We can clean those up. But our curve, I think there's still a fair amount of material here we need to remove because it feels a little thick. You can use your double-ended calipers or something like that to get in there and just get an accurate measurement if you need. Or if you're unsure where you're at on your thickness. Alright, that feels a lot better. So now I'll use my scraper to refine the inside curve and the shape and tool marks and get everything out. So we'll turn this back on. We'll go to our bowl scraper. This has a French curve profile on it. Allow you to get in there and get those curves. And then I'll bump my speed up just a bit. I'm about 1400, 1500 RPM. And then I'm just gonna lightly glide that scraper in and out. I'm not removing a bunch of material. I just wanna kiss that surface and just refine it. I think my tool rest is just a touch high for that tool. If you're going really thin on your bowl thickness, these standard scrapers can get a little too aggressive, so you might want to go with a negative rake. All right, let's stop the lathe and see how it looks. All right, so we have a really good contour on the inside now. There's no ridges or anything in there. So we've got a good profile, good wall thickness. It's nice and consistent. We've got our undercut rim here and the face is cut really clean. So now we're ready to sand. We'll sand this out, get the inside nice and clean. We'll sand the rim and try and blend that to the area on the outside that's just a hair out of true that we cut through. We'll sand that and blend those two areas together, and then we'll throw our sanding sealer on and then we can flip it around. So I'll get my dust mask back out, because this stuff, now that it's dry, is really dusty and I don't particularly care for walnut dust. So we'll start with our 220 again. So a couple of things I want to be careful of when I'm sanding is I want to make sure that drill is moving all the time. I never want to stay in one place for too long or else you create a low spot, especially down in the center. Because it's sanding on both the uphill and downhill when it's spinning, it wallows out the bottom really fast. So you want to just kind of go across that and blend that without staying there too long. The other consideration is when I'm sanding up towards this undercut rim, I want to sand right up to the rim, but not across it, because it'll soften that detail and it'll not look as good and you won't feel the undercut as much. So I want to make sure that I keep that nice crisp detail line there. So the 220 is cutting well. Let's keep sanding. We'll sand the rim in this outside piece. So right now I'm just inspecting the surface. The rim's looking pretty good here. You can see me blending and rolling that radius here on the end. So now all I need to do is blend where we cut and then that area between where we sanded and finished already, and then where we kind of cut the exterior here. So I'm just going to sand that a little bit more, and then we can move on to our 320. But the inside looks really good. There's a teeny little mark right there I'll sand out, but there's really no other tool marks in there, and the surface is nice and smooth, and we've got a good contour. So all right, now we'll move on to our 320. So we've got the exterior sanded and blended well. That lines there obviously are just from where the finish is and isn't, but the inside looks pretty good. If you do see a spot that, if you see an issue on the inside, you can always stop the lathe and just spot sand it like this. There's a little bit of a mark right there just on that undercut rim. You want to be careful not to do that with your more aggressive grits, because a lot of times you can create a little divot, something like that. So but you can see that figure is really starting to pop now. That's just insane, and I'm extremely excited to get this turned and finished. So now that we're good with the 320, we'll go on to our 400. And then we'll go 600, 800, and then we'll throw our sanding sealer on. All right, now that we're done with our sandpaper, let's get our denatured alcohol. We'll get rid of all the dust on the surface. See all the dust we're picking up off there? Just double check it before you put all your sanding stuff away. Make sure you don't have any ridges or imperfections you're going to need to get rid of after you put some sanding sealer on, because that stuff will clog up your discs really fast. All right, now the alcohol is dried. Let's get a rag and we'll put on some sanding sealer. Give us a really good base for our final finish. If you need to as well, you can cut this sanding sealer back a bit with some lacquer thinner. 50-50 or 60-40 is a really good place to start. That'll help it penetrate a little bit better. And then it'll be less solids as well. So make sure we get a bunch of sanding sealer on the outside of the rim that we cut through and sanded. All right, now we'll get a clean section of rag and just kind of buff this out. And then make sure you set your rags off to the side that have finish on them so they can dry out. You don't have to worry about a fire. And now we can buff the inside and this outside with some scratch free. That's going to refine the surface even more. It'll cut those streaks out of the sanding sealer that we got. One other thing too is that we get a lot of questions about putting finish on top of the scratch free. But because there's not a lot of wax content per se in this finish in particular, most finishes that you'll put on top of it have a solvent in it, and that cuts through the wax no problem. So as far as putting a finish on this, the only things really that I'd have a consideration or do anything different would be if I'm putting a spray lacquer on top or something similar to a spray type finish. I would definitely strip it with some thinner first. But for most finishes, for wood turning, you can put straight on top of the scratch free. If you're worried about it, get some lacquer thinner or denatured alcohol and just strip the surface just in case. But we bumped our speed up for the polishing here. That scratch-free has a grit in it, so it's going to refine the surface and just make that figure pop even more. One thing I have noticed is the Yorkshire grit. That one has more wax in it and different waxes, and that stuff I have had issues with finishes on top of, so I definitely strip that. But as far as scratch-free goes, I haven't noticed anything, and we put this on almost every single piece before we put a finish on it. So just get a clean section of rag and just buff away any excess wax. And then we can stop the lathe and just see how good the figure pops on this. Wow, that's crazy. Look at the curl in that piece. So if we inspect our surface, we want to make sure we don't have any sanding marks, any torn grain, any issues there. It looks pretty good. On the rim, it's a little streaky. I think I have some excess sanding sealer. I'm just going to hit with some steel wool, something a little bit coarser. Maybe that Merlon will go back through and just try and cut through some of those streaks. That's one nice thing about thinning the sanding sealer. You don't get the streaks as often. Sometimes in the original formula, it's a little, if you go too heavy on your coats, you get a little streaks. So I'm just trying to cut back through that and we'll get our scratch-free back on there. There we go. I can already tell those streaks are gone off the rim now from the light. Got a little shaving in there I don't want to scratch the surface with. Yeah, that looks really good. I'm really happy with that. The shape's really good. We've got a nice undercut rim, a nice rounded rim. If we compare that to Glenn's bowl, I wouldn't say it's as good, but it's similar. But the shape's really good on the inside. Nice big open bowl, but undercut. Allows that figure to really pop. You got a really good contour in there to show that off. And the surface is refined well enough to allow the light to reflect through the wood. So really happy with that. Let's take it out of the chuck. So we've taken this off the chuck. That allows you to see how the light reflects inside the bowl and feel it, and check the rim. So if you pick it up, you want a nice soft rolled over rim, and then you can feel that undercut with your thumbs. So I'm really happy with the way the inside of that turned out in this top edge of the rim. So now we can remount this in our remounting jaws and then finalize our foot. But I'm really happy with that. I'm excited to get this turned and finished. And the other thing too is once we put our final finish on there, it'll darken it up a little bit and make that wood pop even more. So that's just an incredible piece of wood right there. All right, to turn the base of this, you can use vacuum chucks, you can use the remounting jaws. I'll be using the Longboard chuck. I found this to be a pretty good option. The only downside to it is the RPM maximum on this is 600. So you're not cutting really efficiently when you're trying to shear scrape and do stuff on the bottom of the bowl. But the benefit is I can just mount it directly into my chuck jaws, and I don't have to take all my jaws on and off or have a dedicated chuck for it. But I'll show you a couple tips I've learned with this. Instead of having this in your chuck and then putting the piece in there and trying to tighten it down, I found the best way is just putting your piece on your lathe bed and then dropping this over the top and adjusting those plates, and that'll help it find its center point a lot better. And then you can start snugging up the grippers. So once they get a little bit finger tight, then I'll start working around in kind of a star pattern. That way you get even pressure, you don't push it too far off center. If you really want to be kind of pedantic about it, you could definitely go in an exact star pattern to tighten these up. All right, so we're about 15 inch-pounds on these. Just kind of finger tight, not hand tight. I'm not really cranking these down. If you get too crazy on the torque on these, it'll pull them out of center. But the nice thing is these silicone grippers, they don't mar the surface. So once I finish that, I don't have to worry about tool marks or anything being left behind up there. but it does come at a cost of having a reduced turning speed. So if you went with like the Vic adjusted jaws, you can turn a little bit faster with those. And those are a really good remounting jaw. I use those most of the time. But for smaller pieces like this, I kind of prefer the Longworth just because I don't have to take all my jaws off. And then definitely snug that down on the Longworth. Whenever you're returning a piece, absolutely we want to support this with our tailstock. All right, so I'll set my tool rest up, make sure that my grippers aren't going to come in contact with the tool rest because that would get really exciting. And then we'll bring up our tailstock for extra support. Because our depth is pretty close, you know, we've got about a 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 in the bottom here. I don't want to have a big center divot that I'm going to have to turn out. So I'll use my pen mandrel knurled nut as a shim to still give me support, but it's not going to leave a big old dent in the bottom of the piece. You could use a bunch of different things to do that, but that's just on my workbench, so might as well use it. Give that a quick spin, make sure we're not contacting, and then anytime I use these Longworth chucks, I like to turn the lathe on, you know, completely stopped, and then I'll bring up the speed up to my turning speed because I want to catch something going wrong before I'm at my turning speed if it is going to go bad. So we're going to go right up to that 600 RPM max that they recommend. The other metal jaw versions, you can go a little bit faster, so those are some advantages, but they do come at a cost of having to install them and take them off after each use. So we're running pretty true. It's just a hair out around here, but we'll blend that in no problem, and then we'll reduce that contour here, and we'll incorporate the foot into our overall piece. I think having that little extra material will give it a little more height, better aesthetics, as well as reducing the foot size. And most of this turning here on this end is going to be done shear scraping. So I'm going to start shear scraping the foot. You can hear that slower RPM just doesn't cut as efficiently as I'd like. Ideally, I'd be at 1200 RPM, double the speed. As I'm roughing that out, I just want to make sure my contours are looking right still. Back in the early days, I would be so excited to get a piece finished that I just would forget about the shape and then realize, oh crap, I turned away too much material, and then the shape was terrible. So slow down and just take a look at your line and your horizons, make sure your contour is going to be nice. Especially on a piece as nice as this walnut. Even though we're turning slower, we're still getting really clean cuts. Some good shavings. You can always tell how a cut's happening, obviously by the sound, how it looks, and then the shavings you're getting off the tool. If you're getting big chips, I don't really have any chips in here because we didn't do much scraping, but if you're getting curls and ribbons, you're cutting clean. So ideally, I'd get a push cut going here, but with the tool, with the tailstock in place, it's kind of limited on on access to it. And I can't really shear scrape that really tight radius at the bottom, so we're just going to do a regular scrape. And we're almost there. Finally cut through that mark where the chuck jaws were. Now we can true up the foot. And with that lower turning speed, your feed rate needs to be a lot slower. If I just try and jam that across that, it's going to tear the fibers out, so I need to be nice and slow and controlled. So the surface actually cut pretty clean, considering I had to do a scrape down right in that tight radius. Pretty happy with that though. And then this line here where we've sanded and then the raw area, we'll blend that together with our sanding drill. We'll blend those areas. The shape on there is looking really nice and tidy. We got a good mix from our nice curve to that little concave section here. And then we'll get our foot finished trued up, and then we'll do a nice little, kind of a little decorative recess there. And that'll give you a nice area to sign your name on the piece as well. Real quick, inspecting the surface, I can see my pin marks from my moisture meter. So I'm going to need to keep an eye on those and make sure I turn those out. As far as my foot diameter goes, the outside diameter is good. The inner diameter will be right about there, and it'll be slightly concave. That way if the bowl does move at all, it'll still sit pretty flat on the table. And then this will have a nice decorative recess inside that Sharpie line. I'll switch back to my 3/8 gouge. Now that's a lot cleaner surface than the scrape. I'll get my skew, see if I've got clearance in there to cut that recess. With the tailstock in place. That way I can just define that and then get that foot established and finalized before I get rid of my tailstock. Okay, so now that we have most of that decorative recess cut out, we've got our foot established and our exterior trued up and our contour correct, I'll power sand the outside here and then the foot, and then we can remove our tailstock and then do some light cuts to get rid of that little nub, and then we'll sand the bottom. And because we're already at our 600 turning speed, that's our sanding speed as well. Okay, you can see where we've blended those lines between the finished area and the raw area. When I was sanding that, I was just kind of rolling that in there in that little concave section to make sure I get in that corner. And then I sanded the foot, and now I've got a nice crisp foot detail line. So I want to be careful when I'm sanding not to roll that over and soften that, because it just looks cheap, you know, when you do that. So just double checking and making sure that that base of the foot is concave. Just get a straight edge. Make sure that the lines are going inward. 320 is looking good. There's a couple marks right here around this concave section. We'll touch up. Looks pretty good. Now we can go on to our 400. And obviously we could have turned that away, gotten rid of the tailstock and done all the sanding at one time, but I try to like to maintain as much support on the piece as possible, especially if you're doing coarser grits because it's putting a lot more stress on the material. And we'll do this up to that 800 grit as well. Right now we're at 600. All right, now let's hit that with our denatured alcohol. And the nice thing is that stuff dries really fast. And then we can put our sanding sealer. All right, and we'll just let that cure over and we'll finish turning the inside of that foot and sand that, and then we can polish and buff the outside. Get ourselves at center working height. And now that we're unsupported, we want to be very careful with our cuts, make sure we're not taking too much material off. I just do really light passes. I have had this come out of the chuck before and it gets really exciting. So if anything, make sure you wear a face shield just in case it does come off the lathe. But you can prevent all that if you just do light cuts, make sure you're nice and supported, and you don't have any catches. Okay, and then to get into this side, down into that undercut, I'm actually going to come from this direction. So I'm getting a little bit of chatter. I'm just going to scoot that up a little bit. So whenever you're in a chuck like this, if you hear a lot of weird noises, that means the chuck doesn't like the force being put on it. So take a lighter cut or change what type of cut you're doing. So like it's not liking that. You can hear that sound. Those little rubber grippers I think are hanging on for dear life. So instead of doing a bevel riding cut, I'll just use my scraper. And just do really light cuts. Try to scrape with a gouge here and see how it does. Yeah, it's doing okay. Unfortunately, we can't get down into the corner with that gouge. All right, we've got a bit of a high spot. Getting a little thin in the bottom, which is okay. It removes a lot of that weight. But if it starts sounding really thin, you can tell the difference between a bowl that's where you're about to go through the center or not. So. All right. I think that's ready to sand. And because we didn't get a very good surface off the tool, I'll actually go back down to my 180 to do the very bottom. There we go, we got that surface nice and flattened up. 180 is usually a little too coarse for what I like. It leaves a lot of scratches behind. So I usually start with 220, and that's why you always try and get the best surface you can off the tool. It'll save you a lot of time sanding. Right now we're on our 220, and then just feather that across. Try and keep that drill moving, just try and feather it across the surface and keep the pressure even. And then we'll hit that corner. We'll just take the paper off and sand right in there with our corner of our paper. We're up to our 320 now. And then we'll take this off, get that inside edge. All right, so now we're ready for some DNA. Make sure you get down in that corner, because a lot of times you get sanding dust kind of packed into the corners. And I don't want to seal and trap that in there with the finish. So now we can get our sanding sealer. I'll just go over this area one more time for good measure. And then lay those finish rags out to dry. But I really like the shape we got, incorporating the foot in instead of just turning that away. It allowed us to have a little extra material here to do a nice decorative recess and get our concave foot, but the overall shape I think is really nice. So we'll just try and friction buff this now. And then I'll get that Merlon back out because I can definitely see some streaking in the finish. This will just knock all those high spots down. This is a little bit coarser than the scratch free is, and the scratch free won't get rid of some of these heavier scratches, or heavier streaks, I say. Fold that over and just get into that corner just in case there's some buildup. Definitely watch your fingers once you start working up the bowl. You don't want to snag one of those grippers. All right. And since we can't really bump the speed up a bit because of the chuck, we'll just buff it at that 600 RPM. All right, now that we've buffed that with our scratch free, we can stop the lathe and take a look. So you can see just how gorgeous the figure is in this piece. I'm really excited to be able to work on a piece like this. You don't get walnut this nice very often, so it's a real treat to turn a piece like this, and hopefully it'll turn into a really nice bowl I can use one day. So let's take this out of the chuck. We'll wipe down all the dust. We've got a bunch of debris up here near the top where the grippers are. Let's unscrew this. And then we'll just buff out those streaks we got by hand, and then we can throw our top coat finish on. Okay, once all the grippers are loose, you can slide those plates and it'll just come right out of the chuck. And then I'll take this off the lathe while I'm at it just so it's out of my way. But now we're ready for our final finish. So I'm going to give this a good wipe down with just a clean rag, and then we'll use our tried and true finish. I like the varnish oil the best. We'll put a nice heavy coat on, let that sit for 15 minutes, and let that soak in and see if there's any dry areas that we need to reapply. And then after an hour or so, we'll come and buff off all the excess finish, and then we'll let this sit for 24 hours. All right, so to prep for our final finish, I'm just going to wipe this off, get rid of any loose dust before we put our finish on. And then we're using the tried and true varnish oil. With this stuff, I like to do kind of a heavy saturating coat to start. And then I'll come back in 15 minutes and see if there's any dry areas that have absorbed and pulled all that in. And I'll put some more where it looks dry. After about an hour or so of letting that sit, I'll wipe off any excess finish, and then I'll let that sit for 24 hours, to 48 hours and let that cure. But I like to go a little heavy on the first coat. With the sanding sealer, you don't need to go super heavy because it's not going to pull in very far because the sanding sealer's sealed those fibers off quite a bit. But if you're using raw wood that you didn't put anything on before, you're going to want to go a little heavier. But you can see with that first coat of finish on there, that figure just pops like crazy. So, nice thing about this stuff is it is food safe, and it has a really good smell to it. It smells like boiled linseed oil kind of, but it won't stink up your shop like a lot of finishes. So I'm going to go a little heavy on there, go heavy on the rim, and then we'll flip it over. You can see that how it kind of looks dry. And as soon as we put that coat on, it gives it that really rich, beautiful color that walnut's known for. And the nice thing about the tried and true is it gives it a really good amber, warm feel to the wood. Doesn't look plasticky or fake. Spray lacquers look good for like a decorative piece where you put color on it, or instruments and things like that. But for a utilitarian piece, you want it to retain that natural warmth, something that invites you to go over to pick it up. So we'll go heavy on that first coat, and then we'll just sit this down and let that soak in. Come back in about 15 minutes and see if we need to reapply any more finish. And then we'll let it sit for an hour or so. And then wipe off any excess finish so we don't have, some rough areas that cure, like we had streaking before with the sanding sealer. So with these finish rags though, you definitely want to set these out. I'll just set that over my tool rest handle because I'm going to be coming back here in just a minute. And we'll cover that lid up as well. So I'll see you guys in a minute. All right, so we've let our first coat of finish sit on there for about 30 minutes or so. And you can see the dry areas and the wet areas on the finish. So all the wet areas, the surface obviously is staying on the surface, but the dry areas, it's pulled that finish in, and we can put some more finish on and buff that in. And this time we'll do just a light coat, and then we'll let it sit for 24 hours. So I'll get my rag we used earlier. Just put a small amount back on the rag, and then this will be a fairly light coat, nice even light coat. And then we'll let this sit and cure over fully for 24 hours. You don't want to go heavy on the coat you're going to let cure overnight because you can have it be kind of thick and globby in certain areas. So we want to do just a nice light coat, even consistent. And then that should give us our good base for our final top coat, which we'll do after the 24 hours cure period. And then that piece will be done. So we'll just wipe this in nice and even, try and avoid any rag marks or anything, fingerprints. But you can see on the outside all those dry areas where it's just pulled that finish in. On a piece that doesn't have any sanding sealer on it, it'll definitely pull in a lot more finish. So you'll want to go pretty heavy on your first coat. But where this has the sanding sealer on it, it didn't really pull in too much finish. Okay, I think the outside's good. I'll just set that down one more time and then just wipe off my finger marks. And then we'll just leave this. You can set it aside and just let it dry for 24 hours. And if you don't want to do a second coat, you don't have to. Second coat just helps give it a little more protection and durability. You could also just throw a wax on top after it cures. So we'll let this sit for 24 hours and we'll come back. All right, so we've let this piece cure for about 24 hours, so the finish is ready to go. If you want to, you could throw one more coat of that varnish oil on there, But for this piece, I'm going to throw on a top coat of wax, and this is just the Mylan's wax. It's a blend of some thinning agents and then beeswax and some other waxes in there. But the finish looks really nice, rich, close to the wood finish. But let's just throw on a protective top coat wax. And the nice thing about that too is you can reapply this in your kitchen or something after you've been using the bowl. Just throw a little bit of wax on there, it'll help protect the wood. But however, we do have the sanding sealer as the original base, plus that tried and true on there. This should be a really durable piece for many years of use. So I always like to throw the wax on there. That just helps repel water, any moisture from soaking down into the wood fibers and making them swell or anything like that. But I just buffed this on. The reason I like this wax in particular for a top coat is it's got a fair amount of thinners in it, so it's really easy to spread and apply. Some of those other waxes out there are pretty stiff out of the can, and they don't go on very easy, and you have to really kind of buff them in. So this one goes on really easy, and then it buffs off really easy as well. I actually use this stuff on my kitchen table as well to help repel water. But I'm super happy with this piece of wood we're working with today. That figured walnut is just absolutely gorgeous. And I just like to work that in, make sure I get it everywhere, get full coverage of the wax. And then once it's fully coated, I'll just sit that down and we'll get a clean rag and then buff off any excess wax. And because the wax has solvents in it, you want to make sure you let your rags sit out to dry. That way you don't worry about them catching on fire on you. You can see it goes a little hazy once the wax kind of dries. It goes a little white. So once it's like that, then you can buff that off. And then we should get a nice satin sheen to it. All right, that's looking pretty good. So now we have a really good finish on there that's going to protect the wood as well as the top coat of wax. But I think this bowl is about done. All right, so I think our bowl is complete. It's been an absolute privilege turning a piece of walnut this figured. The color and figure going through this is just absolutely gorgeous. This will make a really nice piece to put in your kitchen. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And if you want more wood turning videos, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. But we'll see you guys next time.